Harry and Tom for those excellent presentations. What we had endeavored to do was to lay the foundation for thought, etc., in understanding what Marxism is all about. And I think they've done a very good job. Thank you both. Now we're going to open up the floor for questions and comments. And I would encourage, if you have some comments or questions or concerns or whatever, please share them with today. Brother in the back.
My name is Eric Struck from World Park Branch in Chicago. And in Chicago, we work real closely with a group of Black revolutionaries called the Prisoners of Conscience Committee and Black Panther Party Cubs. It's led by the son of martyred Chairman Fred Hampton Sr., Chairman Fred Jr. And I was just in touch with a couple members of the organization, and they wanted me to deliver official greetings to the conference from the WCC EPBC.
All right.
And they have an event every year that commemorates Chairman Fred Sr.'s birthday, on the day of his birthday, on August 30th. It's the Streets Party. I've been passing around a little stack of the flyer invites. And we were talking, the main theme this year is going to be about who or what created Chirac. And I'm sure you've heard that to describe Chicago because of the level of violence in the Western communities in Chicago. Just wanted to share a real quick quote with you. We were having a discussion about this when I was picking these flyers up the other day. This is from a book called False Nationalism, False Internationalism by Kesera Itani. Imperialism would rather that its colonial subjects stay unarmed and passive, but this can no longer be. The Black nation is armed and will never be disarmed. And just as in old pre-revolutionary China, the heightened imperialist social dislocation is forcing many into the streets, futureless and desperate. Rather than have Black people turn to combining revolutionary violence, the authorities have encouraged the growth of warlord gangs. These gangs spread drug pacification, disorganize the community, absorb angry and desperate youth and killing each other, and act as police informers and mercenary agents. Just as in the old China of the 1920s, urban areas where Black proletarians and local elements are concentrated are increasingly chaotic armed camps and warlords. We must see this as a dialectical process. Imperialism is brutally creating the raw human material of revolution or reaction.
Thank you very much, Harry. Linda.
What's your thoughts about the bank today? The Bank of America was giving people money. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, the predatory lending practiced by these banks was so massive that it can't be completely ignored by the system. So they just announced a new settlement with Bank of America, where they're being forward. The settlement supposedly for $16 billion. That's a trifle, of course, compared to the trillions of dollars, literally trillions of dollars, that they stole from oppressed people and homeowners all over the country. And the effect of this settlement is pretty what it's going to be. And the other thing is about $4 billion of it is actually going to be recovered by the banks in tax breaks. In other words, they're going to have to pay off some of the cities, but that's all tax deductible income. They're going to have to, supposedly, they're going to give some homeowners a principal reduction. We'll see how many really get it. The biggest problem, though, is that the millions of people who were displaced, the Bank of America, through countrywide division, was the worst of one of the worst of the subprime lenders. It's not going to put anybody back in their homes. It's not going to really deal with the millions who already lost their homes. Right. We'll see what they really do in terms of amount. Our experience has been that a handful of people, you deal with the same, creatures that you dealt with all along. So, it's a drop in the bucket compared to what they should pay. But on the other hand, it shows that these banks, that even the federal government recognizes that these banks owe the people for what they did. And that's one of the things that we keep trying to raise in the struggle in Detroit, that here, Bank of America is a beneficiary of the interest rate swaps that the city actually paid. Here we are in the city that probably was the hardest hit by Countrywide and Bank of America, the subprime lending. Our government, under the emergency management, is paying Bank of America $65 billion on interest rate swaps. They're also beneficiaries of the swaps in the water. They're cutting off water while Bank of America gets paid on really swindles they did against the city. So it establishes what we say. The banks owe us. And they owe us a lot more than the $16 billion reflected. And if they owe anybody, they owe the people in Detroit. And in this bankruptcy that we're going through, the banks should be paying us, not us paying the banks. And there's not one worker, not one pensioner should be losing anything. Not one person should have their water cut off. We should recover from those who destroyed our communities, which are these banks. So anyway, it's kind of a little Band-Aid that the system has been forced to put on to cover up the complete destruction of the economy. And of course, they're paying them back $16 billion. From Bank of America itself received $40 billion in the first bailout. They've been the beneficiaries of the Federal Reserve, giving them 0% interest loans. So, all I can say is it's kind of a joke, but it does establish the culpability of these banks. And let's go after what they really recover. They owe us reparations. They owe the city's reparations for what they've done. And let's demand and let's fight to get those reparations, get that money in the hands of the working class so we can use that money to rebuild it. Let's eliminate these banks that are nothing but parasites, period.
Well, I'll call myself and then recognize Joe, but it is interesting. They keep, taking these judgments against these banks or getting all this money. But I don't know one homeowner, one family that's gotten a single dime of this money. They're always announcing these awards.
Right.
But what happens to it?
Right.
Do we know? No. And then suddenly it's there, and then they got, and not only that, they get a tax break because they paid this money. But did that money somehow reach the pockets of the families that they destroyed in foreclosing their homes with these predatory loans? No. So exactly what's going on here? This is just another capitalist smoke and mirrors that mean absolutely nothing because they're not translating. If somebody knows where these billions of dollars in awards and against these banks are going, if they know, please give us a call and let us know. Joe.
What were some of the pitfalls of revolutionary parties and struggle during the 60s and 70s that led for them to lose so much membership and such a hold on society?
I wouldn't have as much of an idea as you would.
Well, it's a big question. I mean, of course, a lot of the leadership of the revolutionary struggles were in the oppressed communities, with groups like the Black Panthers, the Young Lords in the Puerto Rican community, the Brown Berets, the Ewok Kuhn in the Asian community, and of course AIM. And probably the biggest factor in to a great degree the destruction was repression. And that you take the Panthers were growing so fast around the country that they couldn't keep up with their own growth. People were just forming Black Panther chapters, and the Black Panthers were an ideological group. I mean, they were revolutionary communists, and if you read, and they were very young, and they were developing their ideological perspective as they went. But you see Fred Hampton. We have a great film on Fred Hampton, and it was very clear they were completely anti-capitalist and pro-socialist. So what did they do? But Fred Hampton was murdered in his bed when he was 21 years old. The states basically they set up a whole squad, COINTELPRO, to target the leaders in the oppressed nations, who in many ways were the leadership of the revolutionary movement. And one of the weaknesses of the left back then is the student movement and many of the groups didn't come to their defense like they needed to. Workers' World did. I mean, was recognized by the Black Panthers as probably the only of the revolutionary parties that came forward. And when we first formed in Detroit and around the country, most of our work was defending Black Panthers against oppression, against repression. And we actually had the view that over time that there could be a federation of parties, and among they recognize the right of self-determination within it, but hopefully there'd be a coming together that may be and it still may be the case in this country. Who knows how it'll develop? But unfortunately, most of the left didn't come to the defense of the Black Panthers. The kind of the traditional anti-war groups separated the fight for Black liberation from the fight against the war. I remember at one point, they had a big march in New York right when the Panther, what was it called, the Panther 21,
Yeah.
were jailed, and and there was a struggle, for the leadership to say, let's use this demonstration to defend the Panther 21, and they wouldn't do it. I mean, the SWP, the CP, the more moderates wouldn't do it. Actually, Bernadette Devlin from Ireland came in, they gave her the key to the city, and she went right to the jail and gave it to the Panther 21, which I thought was a great move. It showed the Irish solidarity of the Irish struggle with the black struggle. But I think that was a big factor. The other factor, though, that we shouldn't underestimate, even though it was a more revolutionary period, and of course the revolutionary period was worldwide. The Vietnamese were defeating the U.S. In Africa, almost all the liberation movements were led by communists in Mozambique and Guinea-Bissau, and the ANC. So I mean, the revolutionary current was strong. Asia, Laos was led by communists. Cambodia. I mean, the revolutionary movement was very strong. So two factors happened, of course. Over the years, the Soviet Union collapsed, and the Soviet Union was able to give a lot of material support to the liberation movements, and that was a big setback. And then the other factor in terms of this country, and that's what's a funny thing, back then, even though the movement was more dynamic, but it was mostly a movement among the oppressed and among the youth who were feeling the effects of the war. But the working class was still, at least sectors of the working class were still doing fairly well. I mean, auto workers were making a decent wage. I mean, Lenin talked about how imperialism, based on the super exploitation of workers, builds up an aristocracy of labor, right? They'll pay the workers in the oppressor nation, enough money to keep them quiet. And so if you remember then, in the anti-war movements, you didn't see a lot of union participation in anti-war movements. Like, you see a lot more now. Because the working class, they were able, based on the U.S. imperialism was such in a dominant position that they could kind of buy off a sector of the workers. The contradiction we're in now is that from an ideological standpoint, the world movement is much weaker, right? When you look around the world, with the exception probably of Latin America, where Cuba's held on, because they've held on, you see Venezuela and Ecuador, they've inspired there is a revolutionary left in that sector of Latin America, but overall, on a world scale, the revolutionary movement has been weakened by the collapse of the Soviet Union and by and even the liberation movements. You don't see the dominant current; it isn't always the left. But in this country, and so there isn't the kind of, back then it was easy to become a Marxist. Let's put it this way: if you were a revolutionary and you were against the war and you really studied, you went to Marxism, because everyone who you supported was Marxist,
Even the Panthers.
Go ahead, you still talk about it.
No, I mean, they publish, in their paper, they published Mao, they published the Red Book, it was open, they were openly Marxist.
Right. So it was like, in a way it was easier. But the contradiction is, ideologically, the subjective factor is a lot weaker now. The working class is also is under the gun in this country. There's a fundamental lowering of wages. And kind of the division that they promoted within the working class then is a lot less now. Look at auto workers make $14 an hour, not $28 an hour, the new ones, They're low. So the workers and the public workers used to be when they're public worker, you get a good job for life. Now they're taking their pensions, they're lowering their wages. The work teachers here just got a 10% wage cut. It's the war on the workers is more intense. So the objective ability to move the working class is greater. It's the subjective factor. You see, the orientation. And that's why more than ever we got to build a party. You see, that's the task. I really feel it. I feel the objective conditions for revolutionaries are greater now than they were in the 60s, but it's the subjective that's missing. It's the revolutionary organization that's missing. And that's what we gotta find a way to rebuild. And that's why having a meeting like this is important. And why we do our classes every Saturday, because we gotta build, we gotta find a way to revive revolutionary ideology in a period where I really believe the workers will be more open to it. In some ways, the conditions are better for struggle, even though subjectively it feels a lot worse because the revolutionary movement is weaker. And it's that contradiction. It's the, like he said it very well, it's the subjective and the objective. In the 60s, the subjective was stronger, but the objective conditions within the U.S. were weaker, at least among white workers. Now the objective conditions for unity are greater, but the subjective is weaker. That's what we got to overcome. That's my opinion.
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
My name is Abba Ezekwe. I work here with the Detroit branch of Workers' World. I just wanted to comment on two things. One was the banks, as Debbie was talking about, these so-called settlements, and we've seen them for a number of years now. We've also seen federal funds that have been allocated to various states, ostensibly to help people stay in their homes, all right? Well, what's happening with this money? That's a major question. Now, here in Michigan, we've seen one example. I think it was $500 million came from the Hardest Hit program, which is one of the federal government programs ostensibly to help people stay in their homes, to modify loans and so forth. Most of the money was never spent. It's still in Lansing. I don't know what they're doing with it. They could be using it, to prop up Snyder and his cronies or whatever. I remember in 2010, we're talking about 4 years ago, we held a demonstration at Bank of America one afternoon because Jennifer Granholm, who was under a lot of pressure at the time, she wouldn't impose a moratorium that we requested as early as 2006, and we stepped it up in 2007. She was, I guess she was on her way out of office, so she wanted to make a last splash. So she said, we should release this money, to help people refinance their mortgages and stay in their homes. She said herself, well, the banks won't cooperate. Well, you're the governor. You have some power as an elected official here in the state of Michigan to take action against the banks. She was also the former Attorney General of the state of Michigan before she became governor of the state of Michigan. And then the bank said, well, the state government doesn't have the structure set up in order to process, the assistance from the federal government through the states so they can assist people. But it just illustrates the lack of responsibility and responsiveness on the part of both, finance capital as well as the state in addressing these concrete issues. So we held a demonstration down at Bank of America, and it got covered on the media. And Jerry said, there's $500 million in federal funds that are just sitting there in Lansing, and these monies should be utilized to keep people in their homes. Well, it never happened. So anyway, earlier this year, interestingly enough, we heard that Dan Gilbert, who's one of the big time capitalists here in the Detroit area, he owns Quicken Loans, which is one of the major predatory lenders. He also owns, they've given him like 60 buildings downtown that he owns. Just literally giving him these buildings. He also owns the Cleveland Cavaliers.
Some for $1.
Yeah, for $1, okay, yeah. He also owns the Cleveland Cavaliers basketball team. The Obama administration had a meeting at the White House, I think it was late last year or early this year, where they invited a delegation from Detroit. They didn't invite any of us. They didn't even invite any of the local politicians. They invited Dan Gilbert and some of these other, Mike Duggan, who's the new supposed mayor, suburban white mayor, the first one in 40 years to run Detroit. Went to the White House and they set up what they call a Detroit Blight Removal Authority, a task force. It was called an authority before that. When it was called an authority, it was headed by Pulte, who was one of the largest home construction firms in the United States. Their offices out in Bloomfield Hills. We've had demonstrations out there too. But Dan Gilbert was placed as chair over the Blight Removal Task Force. Now just think about that. Here's one of the largest real estate magnates, one of the largest predatory lenders and bankers who owns, professional sports teams. He's placed over running a blight removal task force here in the city of Detroit. It's clearly a conflict of interest. What they did, they hired a mapping firm to go through the entire city of Detroit and, put a mark on every single piece of property, every single parcel of land to determine whether or not it should stand or whether or not it should be taken over by this blight removal task force. Earlier in the spring, they went around in the city and they were putting up signs on people's homes saying that this house is abandoned, and if you don't contact us in 3 days, we're going to sue you for the title of your house. It's outrageous. This is what they were doing. So this is the kind of thing that's going on. So you have this clear conflict of interest. You have bankers that are being appointed to supposedly remove blight from the city of Detroit. And we don't deny it. Detroit has been devastated, as a result of the banks. We have tens of thousands of vacant properties, vacant homes. Most people can't afford, to keep their homes up. They're targeting different people, saying you got to do this to your house, you got to do this to your building. It's going to cost you thousands and thousands of dollars. If you can't do it, then they're going to move in and try to condemn. We know some people we've been working with who said, one woman told us, she's been one of the leaders in the anti-bankruptcy struggle. Her house was condemned, in the city here, a few weeks ago. She had to go down and try to challenge them on the condemnation of her home. So this is outrageous, but what's even more outrageous, this same $500 million, from what we understand, it's been published in the media, they're going to use this money not to keep people in the neighborhoods, not to rebuild the neighborhoods, but to tear down blight.
That's right.
The money wasn't intended for that purpose, but this is what they're doing. They're using the money actually to drive more people out of the city of Detroit. So this is really a major struggle. And we've been demanding that these funds be used to pay people's back taxes and to keep people in their homes. But that's not what the people are doing. The second thing I wanted to comment on was that the fact that, as Jerry mentioned, the repression, people have to go back and study this. People who live through it, that we understand it. But the people younger people really need to go back and study the level of repression that was waged against the African American struggle in the United States on 2 or 3 different levels. One level was the raw, state repression. They bought off people. That was another angle that they used to bring certain people into the system, giving them government jobs, even corporate jobs. After the '67 rebellion, Ford Motor Company set up a hiring center right in the heart of the area where the rebellion was. And they immediately hired several thousand people and put them to work in production facilities here in Detroit. See, they had the capacity to do that at that time. Now, if something broke out, I don't think Ford Motor Company has the capacity to bring in thousands of new unemployed people into their system. They just don't. Yeah, they just don't have the capacity to do it. The production is so scattered out all over the world. So I just wanted to mention that as well. And it's heavy repression. And then, of course, the objective factors are key as well. The globalization of capitalism, the whole sense that people can effectively challenge the system. It was a whole ideological war waged on that whole notion that you can change the system fundamentally. So this is why it's important that we go out and actually encourage people, and say, hey, yeah, we can organize. We can, get our message across. We can make a difference in the overall struggle. Because they want to convince people that there's nothing you can do to change the system fundamentally. That people cannot organize. They cannot be united. And that's totally false. We've seen it in other parts of the world. We've seen it here episodically in the United States, like when Wisconsin jumped off. I'm sure Brian will be talking about that later, when the Occupy movement jumped off. The rebellion in Ferguson and other cities. It can happen here. And we just have to be prepared for it. When we have Fergusons that erupt in dozens, if not hundreds of cities throughout the United States. The question is, are we going to be prepared to provide some type of ideological and organizational and political direction to these struggles? I think those are the main questions we are facing today. Thank you.
This brother here.
When you speak of building a revolutionary vanguard, how would you recommend doing that in areas that historically have always been part of the labor aristocracy and have not always had a real revolutionary potential, such as areas of the South and areas where workers are, benefiting off the exploitation of the third world and things of that nature? And areas where socialism has been historically viewed as a dirty word because the media has always pushed that forward. How do you recommend building a vanguard in these areas?
Tell us who you are.
My name's Heath Chad. I'm from Janesville, Wisconsin.
Should we all introduce ourselves? No. I imagine we could have, but yeah. I'm sorry. But if you have comments, please introduce yourself. And when we open up the second session, we'll announce our names. So, well, that's a very interesting question, and I know what you're saying, young man. It's like, unfortunately, the first thing you got to do is see where you can locate the cream of the crop, the revolutionary vanguard elements that may or may not be, on the assembly line.
Yeah.
But you strive to draw them by meetings such as this or offering classes, those things that will attract those politically developing or looking for something, looking for an alternative, because they have completely, they've lost any faith in capitalism, and they know there is a difference. It's hard to find,
Yeah.
but you know what? They are out there. They are out there. Look at around here. We have some young men youth that started coming around. It was like a breath of fresh air because we were, it's a group of gray hairs, and so it's a good thing. But I think what you have to just reach out to the ones and twos that you come in contact with, and you see that potential. That's the important thing, is to try to build that vanguard element, who then will be in greater numbers and go out and try to, mobilize the community or respond in the community around the different issues that poor working people are facing every day. David.
Yeah, I want to address that. Organizing is never easy. Even people talk about the 60s. 60s wasn't so easy. There may have been mass movements, but it was always a struggle. But I want to challenge a couple of questions, or the perspective. Remember, we talked about things changing. So when we say socialism has always been a dirty word, that's only because the capitalist class has intensified that campaign to make it a dirty word. If you go back to the early 1900s, the Socialist Party was winning millions of votes. If you look at the Eugene Debs campaign, things like that. And because conditions are changing, that gives us optimism. We're not just cheerful idiots. There are some people who are just we're going to do it because we're right and they're wrong. It's because we understand conditions are changing. Conditions even from the auto workers on the assembly line. That's not what it was 30 years ago. Conditions are changing for them. Doesn't mean that they are, and just because conditions change doesn't mean there's an explosion. As a chemist, I know that you heat water and you look at it from a distance and just water. And you don't know what's happening. And then at some point it just boils and evaporates through boiling off. There's a transition. And the same with Ferguson and social conditions, too. You can't look at it and say, looking at it, we should say Detroit should be in mass rebellion. There should be 1 million communists here. But we know that the social composition is being heated up to an intolerable level, and at some point, which no one has figured out the theory exactly for, but at some point it breaks. And that's when we better have a party in position, even a few people in different areas, because otherwise it's just an explosion. And you don't channel that energy, and people often don't grow. There were huge rebellions in the 60s, and in some areas, like the Black Panthers emerged from them, some other organizations, but in many places just blew off the social pressure, and things went back to the way they were. So, yeah, young people we know generally are more, they don't have the mortgages, the families, other things that perhaps bear down on them. That's always a good place. The oppressed communities who have never had as much, they were not bought off as much, they were always oppressed more, they're often open to it. And then just accidental people who wake up a little earlier than the mass of the other people. That's why we have a newspaper to link our isolated individual communists. We have an organization that stays in touch. We have organizers like Brian who travel throughout various areas to start to put together that rudimentary organization, because the rebellion is coming. We've dealt with it theoretically in a number of books, Capitalism at a Dead End and others. They cannot get their way out of this. This is a new situation. It's not the boom and bust cycles. Even this is we're in the middle of a recovery. It's the most amazing thing when you read the bourgeois press. We're in the middle of a recovery. Yeah, Wall Street's recovered to some extent, but it's a jobless recovery. It's a lower standard of living, and that's been going. The standard of living dropped from about 1972 on average. It's been dropping for 40 years now, 40 some odd years. But it was going down 1 or 2 or 3%, go up 1%, down a couple percent. Now they come at sectors of the population and tell you, Jerry, it's not 20%. The pension cuts are up to 20% across the board, and then they cut our cost of living. So through our lifetimes, for those of us who are retirees, we're losing 18% more. So it's 40% for many of the retirees. 40%, we could have lived with a 2%, 4% cut. Now they're making it impossible. And when things become impossible, people look for some answer, some solution. That's when they really become potential revolutionaries, but they also become potential reactionaries. Because if we're not there with a revolutionary answer, with optimism and racial unity and solidarity with all oppressed, gender oppression, all that, then somebody's going to come and say, yeah, you're being oppressed, and you know who's doing it? It's the black people,
Just
it's
like
the gay
Ukraine.
people.
Just like Ukraine right now, where they've got
Of course.
support in the far-right parties
Right.
that are organizing people.
Right. And and of course, they don't have a leg to stand on, except they never would have done that there, except they're being bolstered by the United States imperialists and European imperialists. So even there, it's showing that they're whipping that up, and they'll whip it up here too. So that's even more reason for the party to strengthen itself, because oppression and anger isn't only important thing. It's also clarity of thought, demands, and organization that can move forward from just a protest to a revolution. Thank you.
I'm going to call myself. Just in following up on what Abiyuni says, I will give you the perspective that I have as an African American. The fact of it is, repression is a good word, and if you understand, you know what that means, you can identify with it. But let's be real, sisters and brothers. The state carried out war against the oppressed nations in this country when they were not in necessarily rebellion, but when they began to make a difference in their communities, etc. If they didn't kill them outright, they went to jail in huge numbers. This has a very chilling effect on people's, on the movement, and certainly on people's willingness to step forward. This is a time when, like today, it was open warfare on African American men. Let's be real. They didn't care if they shot them, in the dark or in their bedrooms or in broad daylight. But the point is, they shot them. Constantly, they were killing. I grew up in a place in Cincinnati where every weekend some young black man lost his life through police. And it just this will have a little stop you moment. And this is exactly what it had. They knew exactly what they needed to do to take the wind out of the sails, and they did not hesitate to do it. But this is America. And this is the America that we need to remind people about when we think about what's happening in Ferguson. It's just a continuation of the old days. Yes, brother. Go ahead, Eric.
Oh, yeah, can I just comment on, the other thing, I would just do a quick comment. One, it's interesting, in the early 70s, communists were gunned down in North Carolina. Right now, North Carolina is our fastest growing branch, and it's the youngest branch. And partly it's because in the South, the traditional unions and organizations never really got a foothold. They couldn't because they were right to work and was so right wing that to fight, you almost have to be more radical, And a lot of our young communists have gotten experience and been hired by unions because they need revolutionaries to organize and have good, and they were growing very. So it's an interesting phenomenon. That's kind of the dialectic that you talked about. That the contradiction of them holding back the struggle now has made it more fertile even for revolutionary ground. The other thing I think that's a big advantage to us, and we're going to use it more, is that, say you're in Janesville?
Yes, I am.
See, being one person, sometimes it was very hard for an individual to function. It's hard when you're one.
Oh, yeah.
But with technology now, we can communicate a lot quicker, you know what I mean? There's a class in Janesville, we could have a class, a first class that has 5 cities in it, it's streamed. And that's a big advantage to us, because there are a lot of people finding their way to Marxism. I mean, people like Tom, Joe, when they come in, we're always blown away, how much they've studied already, because they come in as Marxists, They come in as Marxists. And there's people like that around, and we can find them. And even if where in the past it might have been hard to bring them in because they're isolated, with technology, the resources exist to operate on a whole different plane. Even our own Facebook page now, Chris is one of the administrators, has over 3,000 people on it. Probably half of them are not from the U.S. That we get members joining every week from around the world. It used to be it was hard to do, the contacts internationally were all with the leaders kind of thing. But now grassroots people are able to communicate internationally. So I think the technology also gives us a weapon to build, that we need to, and we're trying to develop it more within our own party to allow us to become more national. So people who formerly would be isolated and be hard, we can bring in a more collective way. And we're struggling with that and grappling with it, but I think that's a key factor in terms of building a national organization.
Okay, Eric, and then, Vivek.
Yeah, I just wanted to support Comrade Dougie on what she was saying in terms of the character of the mass repression that the oppressed nation liberation movement suffered through in the late 60s through the 70s that really in a lot of ways continues to this day. I think the whole architecture for the period that we're in right now for what oppressed nation people are, and especially black people are facing now, actually really started here in the Midwest, because black people were starting to get power in Detroit.
Right.
in the late 60s and early 70s. And there was a particularly powerful combination here in Detroit when the nationalist movement integrated itself with the workers' movement here, with the Revolutionary Union movement, like the Dodge Revolutionary Union movement, and LROM, and everywhere else. And that really, I think, in my opinion, scared the bourgeoisie here down to its core. And they made a decision that they were not going to have jobs for black people in Detroit anymore. And they pulled the plug on the city. And they decided what you're going to be getting instead of jobs, and these were great jobs. This allowed black families to settle down, buy some property, making enough money to send their kids to college. And what happens when that happens? That means that you're going to have, in another generation, when those kids get back from college, you're going to have a more stable community here. You know what I mean? So they couldn't allow that. So they decided that they were going to switch the deal from people getting jobs just mass repression and mass incarceration. You know, and this had its reflection in Chicago, where many street organizations in Chicago were developing in a left-wing direction. You know, the Black Peace Nation in Chicago began to be a black nationalist formation and started partnering up with the Panthers. And then after their leader Jeff Fort was locked up, they emerged later on in the mid-70s as a Muslim organization. You know, and then in the 80s, when every other city around the country was plagued by crack, Jeff Fort said there's going to be no crack in El Lucan neighborhoods and refused to let any of his lieutenants or any of his generals deal with it. And to deepen the chemical counterinsurgency in the black community in Chicago, the feds, along with the Chicago police, beheaded the El Lucan organization and buried Jeff Fort in the prison, under the prison in Florence, Colorado. And they also got rid of his competition, Larry Hoover from the Gangster Disciples, who, when the feds got him, was actually working on a mass voter registration campaign. So in the meantime, what they've given us instead in Chicago is what Chairman Fred Jr. and many others refer to as Chirac, which is a set of conditions where they import violence into oppressed communities, and they import drugs. There was an article in Chicago Reader a few months ago, which is like the quote-unquote independent, paper in Chicago. One of their journalists was doing some research and found out that the DEA offered 2 Sinaloa cartel members amnesty and the freedom to do whatever they wanted to in Chicago in return for a promise of testimony against El Chapo somewhere on down the road years from now. He's been importing, I think it's a ton of cocaine to Chicago per month under the direct supervision of the DEA. So it's funny, but it's not funny that the only jobs that kids can get in oppressed communities now is selling rocks on the corner. Even that's been outsourced to the cartels. So the counterinsurgency has many different faces of it, and it manifests itself not only in mass incarceration but also in the conditions that, like I said, Chairman Fred Jr. has referred to as Chirac.
Okay.
Hi, Rebecca, from Milwaukee, Wisconsin.
It's on.
Okay. Over the last few days, Brian, myself, and Ben went to a few events around the southeastern Wisconsin, and one of them was in Racine, a community that has been hard hit by really losing a lot of the good union jobs. And they've had a lot of foreclosures and everything too. And so we felt there, and Brian gave a talk, and we could really feel the response from people there, starting to talk about their own issues and their own problems, and really just this hunger for something, hunger for some way to fight back. And it wasn't real well defined or anything, but it was, you could feel it, it was there. And then we went to, were very much a part of, recent marches, for Mike Brown and, the people of Ferguson, in solidarity with them, in Milwaukee. And again, it is this need for something. People really feel it. They may not know exactly what or know how to react to these things, but they want to react somehow. And so some people were taking over buildings, there were marches. One group took over a highway exit. But clearly there is a need out there. I'll leave it at that.
So this will end the discussion part of the first panel, and I would now like to welcome to the podium the next panel. Our next panelist, Comrade Tom, will be talking about dialectical and historical materialism and understanding the class struggle. Tom.
All right, to begin, I think one thing that sticks out to me as dialectical materialism can be a really complicated thing to understand. I think, at least it was for me. I spent a lot of time trying to figure it out. But one thing that really caught my attention was actually in the first episode of Breaking Bad, which sounds silly to say, like at this conference, but the main character is a chemistry teacher. In the first episode, in describing chemistry, he, whether consciously or not, is describing the dialectical method. I'll just read that for you. Technically chemistry is the study of matter. Well, I prefer to see it as a study of change. Just think about this. Electrolytes, they change their energy levels. Molecules change their bonds. Elements combine and change into compounds. That's all of life. It's the constant. It's the cycle. It's solution and dissolution and over again. It is growth, decay, and transformation. It's fascinating, really. This method of thought is known as dialectical materialism, and all matter and phenomena follow this universal rule without exception, whether it be chemical matter, individuals, or entire social formations. The basic explanation of dialectical materialism, as David puts it, is things change, as he said just the other day.
I'm a chemist.
Yeah, right. All things are constantly changing. Cells multiply, people age until death, continents are shifting, galaxies continue to move, and the universe as we understand it expanded and is retracting. All phenomena contain within them contradictions, and it is these contradictions which give matter motion. Just as without up there can be no down, without day there can be no night, without death there can be no life. It is this unity of opposites and the struggle between the two that forces change within a given subject, and this concept is universal. The dialectical method isn't inherently a Marxist concept. Applying it to all matter and social relations is, however. While all matter does follow this universal law, human societies do as well, as we are not a creation somehow alien from nature. On the Chinese Revolution and the construction of socialist society, Chairman Mao Zedong said, "In a word, China is a socialist country. Before liberation, she was much the same as a capitalist country. Even now, she practices an 8-grade wage system, distribution according to work, and exchange through money. And in all of this differs very little from the old society. What is different is the system of ownership has been changed." In other words, the struggle between opposites is raging in society even after the socialist revolution and the establishment of a people's republic. China is a socialist country and in some aspects differs very little from the old society. It is the struggle between old and dying capitalism on the one hand and the construction of socialism on the other, and it is this struggle between these two which give motion to the transition from the former to the latter. This historical law, known as historical materialism, does not only apply to the transformation of a capitalist society into a socialist one, but on the contrary, it is a basic formula for all shifts of power from one class to another, including the transition from feudalism to capitalism, from slave society to feudalism, and pre-class society to slave society. The transition from feudalism in Europe to capitalism followed a simple rubric. Feudalism is based off the ownership of land determined by lineage, often by divine right, and the working of that land by serfs. There is a clear distinction between the ruling and laboring classes, however, it does not take the specific form as it does today under capitalist ownership. Within feudalism grew the embryo of commodity production, the linchpin of capitalist mode of production, which differs entirely from the feudal system of ownership and production. As this small class of artisans, shopkeepers, bankers, and the like grew stronger and stronger and began to shape the economy more and more in their image, the weaker the feudal system became and the less able it became to shape society. The less able it became to shape society and hold onto its own political power. The way I tend to look at it sort of like when I visualize it is I think of like, let's just call it a thing. You have a thing, and within that thing is another thing that's which sounds really silly, but the thing that's inside the first thing is what gives the sort of like as I mentioned before, night turning into day. Just the sun, well, the planet is moving in relation to the sun. It's still day, but it's a slow transformation from day into night. Soon enough, it's no longer day, it's no longer night. It sort of became the opposite that's contained within the day. Does that make any sense to everybody? Is everybody following me? Yeah. One example of this in history is the Great French Revolution at the tail end of the 18th century. It marked the end of absolutism and feudalism in Europe's most powerful and prestigious monarchies. Had you asked anyone in society at the time whether a member of the clergy, the aristocracy, shopkeepers, or the serfs themselves, whether or not a revolutionary restructuring of society was on the horizon, let alone possible, they'd all tell you it was nonsense to imagine such a thing. After all, these were monolithic institutions which had literally been dominant for over 1,000 years. However, as I've already mentioned, things change. Today, people hold similar prejudices when it comes to overthrowing imperialism and building socialism in its place. But it is important to note that if we ask the young men and women of Ferguson, who 2 weeks ago, if they could see themselves directly confronting the full force of the repressive state apparatus, assault rifles and tear gas and all, they'd look at you like you're crazy. Again, things change, and they change for a reason. The objective conditions for radical transformation clearly exist, and it is up to us to create the subjective ones necessary to actually push the new system into the forefront. But I don't want to quote. I hate to quote Mao twice in the same paper. But as he said, the future is bright, the road is torturous. Thank you.